Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate your patience as we get started this afternoon. I'm seeing a lot of familiar names, so thank you so much for joining us. If you were here with the intent of seeing the session about observable instructional practice in the ESL Classroom, you're in the right place, so thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to kick us off with a very quick poll to just get an idea of what everyone's roles are within their program. Oh, and you all are starting to introduce yourself in the chat box. Wonderful. But here's a quick poll for you. Great. Program administrators, ESL instructors. Great. Fabulous. Awesome. So we have administrators and ESL instructors and others, which are probably people from my team. So that's wonderful news. I have my wonderful esteemed colleague, Susie Monty, with me today. She's going to be guiding us through our presentation. I'm really excited for the content that she's going to share and the conversation. So kick it over.
So welcome everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your afternoon. I'm really excited to get together around the idea of observable practices. So I'd like to welcome you. And the reason I chose this topic was I've been an instructional specialist for a while. I've had the great opportunity to be in classrooms, which I consider an amazing learning experience for me. Most of what I've learned has come from observing others. And I also did teacher education and taught a methods class with an associated observation class for a while. And what I learned from all of that is that one of the greatest tools for teacher change is actually reflection and observation. So I'll say hi to all of you, and then I'm going to actually take my video off here so it's not distracting because I have all this lovely background, and we'll proceed. So to begin with, I think it would be interesting. Okay, let's do enter. In the chat box, we already know where you're from, but just put one fun detail about yourself that you want to add. One thing I have an issue with virtual environment is I like to really know a little bit about the people I'm interacting with. Some of you I know, some of you I don't, but if you feel like it, just put something in and make sure that it's visible to everyone, all the attendees. Just a fun fact, like people may not know that I actually am fluent in a dead language, which is Greek, because I love languages. So that's just a fun thing. But today together we will briefly reflect on how instructional practice is viewed. We will contribute to the identification of some observable instructional practices, so you'll participate in that with me. So start thinking about that. And we'll engage in a brief review of a number of practices. Observable means it's objective. You can see it, it's there, it's not subjective. My goal today is that we raise awareness of some practices. So I hope you're all enjoying reading some of this. Someone has a sweet puppy daughter and a real daughter. Someone's a preacher's wife. We have lots of fun little information, and hopefully in reading that and you putting some things in the chat box, it gets everybody, number one, using the chat box, but also comfortable with sharing. So that was my purpose there. So let's together think about a few things, and let's have our awareness raised about some things maybe we haven't considered. As an introduction to instruction, I think about this a lot, that instruction involves intent. It involves advanced planning and decision-making on what and how with a purpose in mind. So we think a lot about when we plan instruction, where do we want to go with this? You know, what's our end goal? And we work back from that. And we do that in advance, but as we all know in ESL, instruction involves moment-by-moment decision-making. Anyone who's been in an ESL classroom knows that things don't go the way you think, and there are a lot of midstream lesson changes. I think we can all just take a moment and remember some of those funny lesson breakdowns or times we've had to repair, back up, we realize that no one's on the same page. So we can have a wonderful plan, but then we have these things that happen and we respond to them. But what I've noticed is that when I'm in a classroom observing or thinking about my own instruction, I realize that there's a message there, like my decisions, either in advance or at the moment, they reflect fundamentally what I believe about language teaching and learning. And I also have thought about this for a long time, that they send a message to my students. What I'm doing actually sends a message to what I believe about them and how they're able to learn. So that's just something to consider. So as we're moving on, I hope everyone's reading all the fun things in the chat box. My director, Kim Sansone, who had one of her first jobs assisting ELL students. That's so interesting. That's wonderful, Kim. So as I said, what is observable as a result of both of those processes? So let's think a little bit about how instructional practice is viewed. For the next part, we're going to be using the chat box again. I'm glad you're all familiar with it. So let's reflect on observation again. What is objective and what is actually in use? When I was teaching a class in observation, my students would go to the Baltimore City Community College. They would sit on the bells or ELI, either one, the academic or the grant program, and they would take neutral notes. And it was a challenge to get them to just record exactly what they saw without adding anything, any judgment, evaluation. So think back in a time when you were formally observed. Think about the purpose of the observation, and think about whether you receive feedback or not. Even if you're no longer teaching, I'm sure you've had an opportunity to be observed at some point and receive feedback. And when you receive feedback, do you recall specific instructional practices that were described and discussed? Was there a follow-up? Was there dialogue about instruction? And if so, did anything surprise you from the observer's point of view? And if so, what? So in the chat box, if you could briefly type in a response to that. Think about when you were observed. Think about why you observed. Think about when you received feedback. And did anything surprise you? And I'm looking in the chat box. So Kim, she was given feedback that she talked too fast. This is especially challenging. I am from New York and I don't think I talk fast. Caroline was presenting a PowerPoint on job interviewing and well observed, told too much teacher talking. It did not surprise me, but then told students are attentive and engaged. I really like that, Caroline, because actually our students come and they expect to be taught. So even though we're not supposed to do too much teacher talking, many students expect and are fully engaged, even if the teacher's giving a fair amount of information. Pamela, remind others to include attendees. Can't see, oh, everybody please change from all panelists to panelists and attendees so we can see your comments. That must mean I'm reading. Kimberly, can you reshare yours? So I'll share something also. I remember this and it really stuck with me because I care about my students. And I was doing a lesson on weather and eliciting from students some weather words. And a student offered a weather word like I think it was rain, and then I went off on rain, fog. I gave about 5 more words. And the observer said to me, you know, when a student offers something, if you just receive it quietly, it validates the learner. We know English. If we share 5 more words, then it devaluates the learner, and it tends to make them less willing to share. And that stuck with me unbelievably, because the last thing I wanted to do was to override something somebody shared. So I can see Cheryl Dorn has given an excellent comment. And Kim, sometimes talking fast is more natural than slowing it down. I love how you're helping each other. That's awesome. Thank you. Thank you so very much. So that was just to get our engine started with thinking about observation. And let's see, wait a minute. All right, I am having trouble there. Who else could be considered an observer? Before we leave this, when I think about who's observing, again, my students are watching and reading a message in what I'm doing. That example I gave where I gave 5 extra words, you know, the students read, well, she's an expert, she knows, you know? Well, that's no kidding, but also that, you know, I didn't really value what the person gave and acknowledge it. So again, they're reading what we're doing. So the next portion will consider how we all see our own instruction. So we've talked about being observed, we've talking about getting feedback from others, but now I'd like to put ourselves in a reflective role and think and picture our own instruction. So having reflected on observation, we're going to contribute to identification of observable instructional practices based upon thinking about snippets of our own instruction. So picture yourself teaching a part of a recent lesson that you think well or did not go well. I already shared something that did not go well, for which I received feedback on and was permanently changed. Hopefully you can think of something yourself. Create a brief, and I mean 1 minute is actually a long time to watch instructions. So 1 minute mental clip of what was happening in your classroom, thinking about what you were doing. Think in specifics as if you were seeing it right now. What are you doing? What are you saying? How would you describe one thing that could be observed? So take a moment and think about that. While you're doing that, just mentally considering it, and I'm going to ask you to type in the chat box a description of one thing, but while you're thinking about that, I'm going to give you a second example of what I did after I received that feedback, and basically the way I approached it from then on. This is again a level 1 class. We're talking about weather. I walked to the front of the room and I went like, brrr, it's cold outside. Is it sunny? So I waited 5 seconds, which is something else I learned. There was no response. So I went and I thought, oh, this isn't working. So I drew a sun on the board and I pointed and I said, is it sunny? And one student said yes. I said anything else with a gesture that I use all the time to mean someone else contributes. One student said no, no rain. Another one said no hot. And I just nodded my head, said thanks, and then I said anything else? So I changed as a result of that feedback, but also I incorporated a couple of things that are observable. One is wait time. One is leading into set context. In other words, don't just start cold and say, is it sunny? Give them some context. We're going to talk about weather. Another thing is the way that I affirmed rather than elaborated. So now that you've had a chance to think about it, compose a brief description of an observable practice and type it in the text box. So you can see here, a map was drawn on the board. Students were practicing speaking, pointing to directions on the map. So that's actually students who are actively engaged, doing the doing there. Caroline, I used the textbook as a lesson, then used the workbook as a quiz, then used the teacher book. Students loved it. I was exhausted. Does anyone else like to share an example of something that was observable? Something that observable is something that you can see in a moment. Okay, so Kimberly, she's saying, Kim Sansone, we practice handshakes. So she pre-planned to do this, probably because it's a cultural issue, I'm guessing. And so she had the students actually get up, so there was physical activity, and they actually did something that was a part of a business practice or an interview practice. Handshakes are good. Anyone else? Excellent. And if you're instructional specialists, like as mentioned, that you can think of something you've seen, but also most people have had, can remember some of their own practice. So either way, I find that it's fairly challenging to try to come up with these. So, whoa. Okay, so reflect again. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my advanced button. So why are you doing what you're doing? This is a big part of it. So you do something in the classroom. Kimberly, she did a handshake. Someone else had the students pointing to a math activity. That involved either advanced planning or a spontaneous decision, but what underlies that decision? Like what underlies that practice? You have a result of your decision-making process, but where did it come from? Like, why did I do it? And why did I do it in that way? Like, part of teacher growth or part of, understanding and learning from observation is thinking about really, where did that come from? There's a lot of unanalyzed behavior that we do by rote or by habit. It just happens, and we don't really think about it. And when we stop and think, we say, well, why do I do this? Well, for me, wait time came from when I was in a training program. Setting context came from some feedback that I received, as well as not adding to what the students contributed. So I can trace some of what I did back to how I was taught, how I like to learn, or my personal preference in wanting to validate students. That's why that impacted me. The feedback impacted me so much and changed my practice. So where did the practice come from, and why did I do it in that way? So now we're gonna have a little fun. We're gonna make an attempt to unmute and let people share. So like for Kim, where did you decide that you were gonna have them practice handshakes? For someone else, where did you decide that they should come up and point to maps, whatever? So think about the practice. Was it a spontaneous thing? Was it planned? And where did it come from? So if you would like to share, I put a little thing in there. There's controls. You can just raise your hand, and then Gina will unmute you so we can hear from you. How's it going, Gina?
Great. Thanks, Susie. You're doing a wonderful job.
Do you see anyone raising their hand?
No, and my worry is always the tech issues from the other side.
Well, can you explain where the control would be?
Okay, so we have, Cheryl, I'm gonna unmute you and allow you to talk, okay? So I'm gonna first allow, then unmute. So let's see here.
Good, unmute now.
Yep, there you go. Cheryl, thanks for sharing.
Cool. Sure. Okay. Thanks for letting me share. I would say that the practice was partly the result of a spontaneous decision, seeing how many students were struggling to put complete sentences together out of details and a main idea, and wanting them to relate to an example. So, and the practice did come from just simply writing experience of my own and the way the book had formatted them to do brainstorming to add details to their ideas.
Great. So you said that some of it was your idea, some of it was taken from the book, and it was your experience. That's wonderful. Anybody else like to share?
We also have Kim. Kim, I'm gonna unmute you as well.
Tim, go for it.
Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
All right. So thinking back to my time in the classroom, Susie, you already alluded that it's very cultural. A handshake is very cultural. So for these individuals, having the cultural build up to talking about a handshake, because it's not just the handshake, it's body posture, it's eye contact. And so it was definitely advanced planning in the lesson plan to build up to the handshake.
Right.
All about it.
And if I were to guess, I would say that you probably like students to get up and be active. Would that be true?
Oh, absolutely.
I can attest to that too, teaching with Kim before.
Yeah, okay. So thank you. Okay, so thank you for a couple that shared. We'll move on now, and we've got the hand and raise thing figured out, so you're all more tech savvy. So we've just touched on a few things to get us thinking about what we do, what is seen, and why we do what we do. And now I wanted to contribute a few things so you walk away with some actual additional thoughts. Look at this lovely thing that I created. I'm so proud of this. I created this from scratch. This is how you pay attention to learners. And as you notice, you have the board or projector. It's a typical classroom, and you have a computer station, right? The blue arrows are either teacher, like, nonverbal, like acknowledgement or smile, or calling on a student, requesting a response, any type of attending or paying attention to the learner. See the pattern there? This is typical where there's an orientation, really, because we're anchored to the computer desk station. And what I found when I was teaching methods and was using technology, my students that didn't want to be called on, they knew where to sit because they weren't in my line of vision. So to overcome this and send a message that all students are known and seen, one thing is to visualize yourself with like a ball of string attached to where you normally anchor yourself, and picture yourself walking around, and you're hoping that there's quite a tangle by the end of the class, right? Also, one thing I've done is walk to the back of the room and actually teach from the back of the room, just to mix it up. Teach from the middle of the room. Make sure that I pay attention to each learner consciously. So that's something that's very observable, the pattern of how a teacher attends to learners and the message it sends to the learner that you are of value. Another thing is the role of the instructor, planning about what you're doing when the students are doing. Sometimes we have a default habit that we don't even think about what is our role when the students are engaged in individual, pair, or group work. These are typical things the teacher sets up for the next activity. Now think about yourself teaching. You write notes on the board, you do this, you set up your technology, or you sit with a group and either engage with or lead the activity. And engage with versus lead, that's a decision. And it also sends a message to students, whether you're still the teacher in the group or whether you're just a participant and a willing learner. Another one, teacher circulates and monitors for intervention, meaning you're there to help. You clarify, you initiate corrections, you answer questions, you engage other students for assistance, which is also a message like we think you guys can help each other. It doesn't always have to be me. Or a teacher circulates and monitors for assessment, collects sample errors for a target grammar point, notes individual student proficiency with an activity. You know, you're collecting information to go back to. So what you're doing when the students are doing also sends a message to the students. Do you have to hover and intervene and correct? Can they do it on their own? I remember I used to act busy and like just act busy so that they wouldn't be impaired in their ability to interact. And my students learned if they need me, they would call me over. And if I came over and asked for help, they go, no, no, we don't need you. Again, it's just a matter of what's the purpose of the activity, how much do you need to monitor. But pre-planning what you're doing when students are doing is really key. And it has great impact on the learning process. The next one is about transitions. Transitions are an amazing opportunity to accomplish things, but oftentimes transitions when you're going from one activity to another, it can be a matter of habit. Transitions can have a purpose. Here's a typical one that the purpose is just to give direction. Now turn to page 88, start with exercise A. If you have any questions, ask me or your partner. That's very typical, right? Simple directions. Another one, it can be a time check and serve to organize. And these are actual examples from my teachers. Okay, students need more time. Yes, okay, I'll check back with you. Okay, we need to move on. Would you please move to your groups? This is key. Take your books with you. Like students need to know whether or not they need to take their stuff or leave it there when they move around the classroom. That's why I put that in there. So that serves to keep the lesson on time and also help students be organized and know what they're doing. This is an awesome one, elicitation and linking. Okay, we just talked about types of jobs. Now we're going to look at job skills. A skill is something you can do well. If you're a bank teller, what can you do? So you're taking the previous activity and you're actually using a transition to connect to the next activity versus turn to page 69 and we're going to do exercise A, right? This definitely incorporates the students understanding why this lesson is the way it is and how it's tied together. And this last one that I put up there is feedback and connection. We just read an article about recycling here in the US. Before we move on, what did you find most interesting, surprising? Is recycling important in your home country? So you're actually asking students what they felt about what we just did. And you're also helping them make connections between each other when they find out that they have common things, like they both thought it was interesting. People thought the same thing was surprising or not surprising. Some people didn't actually enjoy that. And then also connecting to the home country. So these are really, like I think, transitions are an opportunity to accomplish something more than just going from one activity to another. So think about how you transition. You don't have to do anything for this part, just think about it. What words or gestures do you use? And what do you hope to accomplish when moving from one activity to another? Again, we talked about linking, making connections, eliciting preferences, organization, letting people know whether to take their stuff or not. All these are very discrete things. And when I'm in a classroom, and I'm noting what people are saying, the teachers, when they're doing this, it's like they made a decision that this transition is going to accomplish this, basically. So again, it's a discrete observable how people organize these things. And so we're coming down to the end of the session here. We've talked about, we reflected on observable practices. You contributed some, I offered some real quick, some things. My goal is that you just really start to take the lesson apart, what you're doing, and just keep asking yourself, why am I doing it that way? Where did that come from? You know, what am I accomplishing? What message is this sending to the student? Is there another way to do this? And it, like I said, observing so many hours, I really have learned so much from teachers. There are so many great ways to do so many things in a classroom. There's no one right way. And finding your zone and finding your bent and finding where you're comfortable and it works and you're relaxed and it works for the students is key. And then growing within that realm with your practice. a couple of other things to think about: pacing and timing, how you start, monitor, and end activities, the type of questions you ask, where's the interaction going? Is it mostly teacher-led, student-led? The type of feedback you're giving, when you correct, how you correct, what method you use, are you balancing accuracy and fluency, how you manage classroom, and then how you use the board and things like that. And I think we're just about out of time, right, Gina?
Yes, we are, but that's okay. I wasn't gonna cut you off. This has been really wonderful. Thank you so much, Susie. I think you've provided some really valuable insight for people to, you know, rethink their techniques or rethink the feedback that they are providing to their instructors. So that's just fabulous. So thank you so much for that.
I thank you all for joining.
Yeah,
And I
absolutely.
appreciated all of your activity in the chat column. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And I put a feedback form in the chat box. I'll also be sending this out to everyone who participated in the Institute altogether. All of the presentations, recordings, handouts, etc. will be on our Virtual Training Institute website as soon as I am physically able to get it all up there. So if you don't mind, take a moment to complete the feedback survey, which link is in the chat box there. But otherwise, thank you so much, Susie. We really appreciate your time, and I hope you have a wonderful day, everyone.
All right. Thank you all for contributing. I love your ideas.